All right. Hi, everyone. It looks like we are officially live. It's so great to see those numbers jump into the YouTube live stream. And I know that there's faces behind the computer screen. So it's so great to see you all and joining us today. Welcome, welcome. Um, it is 11 o'clock on the dot over here in Santa Cruz, California, but we'll get started in just about another 30 seconds to give folks the opportunity to get settled into this live stream, get excited for today's program, and maybe you can also go ahead and say hi in the YouTube live chat. Go ahead and say hi, say where you're watching from. We'd love to see where Seymour Center supporters are tuning in. And maybe even during today's program, you can get a quick shout out from myself and Suzanne. All right. Hi, everyone. Excellent. So I am just wasting time again. We'll get started in just about 20 seconds or so, but welcome, welcome. And before we officially get started, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who recently subscribed to the Seymour Center's YouTube channel. I jokingly put out a plea to get us to 100 subscribers, and we did it. We're at 100, and I think a little bit more than that. So thank you all for listening to that plea and joining our YouTube channel. All right, and so it looks like we have folks tuning in from Santa Cruz, from Berkeley. We got the Bay Area is in the house, which is great. But it is 11:02 over here in Santa Cruz, and really there's not a minute to waste any longer. So let's go ahead and officially get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Labside Chat with the Seymour Marine Discovery Center. My name is Jen, and I will be your host for today's program. Today's Labside Chat is an opportunity to have a Q&A style discussion where we get to dive into the brain of a scientist from UC Santa Cruz and really chat about how scientific research plays a role in the understanding and conservation of the world's oceans. I am really excited for today's conversation, and I think everyone watching at home is too, because we have the pleasure of talking with and asking questions to Dr. Suzanne Alonzo. Dr. Suzanne Alonzo is a professor in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department and is also affiliated with the Institute of Marine Sciences here at UC Santa Cruz. We'll be talking about all things fish behavior, social interactions, and some of the awesome places around the world where these fish can be found and where Suzanne does her research. So Suzanne, thank you so much for being here today. It is a real treat to have you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And so like I said earlier, I'm not the only one that is excited that you are here today answering questions because we received so many community questions for you that were all submitted in advance. And I will be asking you those questions today. And I may even sneak in a few of my own if I have the chance. But for those that are tuning in and watching at home, if you didn't have the opportunity to submit a question in advance, not to worry, you can still ask your question. You can go ahead and type it in or submit it in the YouTube live chat feature, and we'll be able to answer those as well. All right, so Suzanne, I feel like we're off to the races. Are you ready for all of those community questions?
Absolutely, I'm excited.
Awesome. So I understand that your lab mostly works with fish and studying some of the really interesting reproductive behaviors and social interactions. But first, I'm hoping that you can help me understand exactly what type of fish you work with. I know that there's so many fish in the ocean and there's so many different types of species that people work with. So I'm curious if you study all fish in the ocean, just a few or a handful or a specific family. Where are you able to conduct most of your research?
Yeah, great question. Well, one of the things I love about fish, I study animal behavior. So one of the great things about fish is they have an incredible diversity. If you can imagine it, they probably do it. There's probably some species that does it. So in my research group, we study a variety of different fishes, both freshwater and marine fishes, slightly more marine fishes. But there is a very particular fish that I have been studying since I was a graduate student, so over 25 years. And it's called the ocellated wrasse, and it's found in the Mediterranean. And so most of my research has focused on that fish and the group that they're in, the family of fishes they're in. But actually, my students and collaborators and I study a wide variety of fishes. We choose the fish that's best for the question that we're interested in.
Definitely. And I know that you look at fish because you study animal behavior. So can you tell me a little bit more about what you are most fascinated about that question, and what type of questions are you really trying to drill down and answer with your research?
Yeah, I think I'm curious about all of it at some level. I joke sometimes that in college I fell in love with animal behavior. Like that's what happened to me. I thought I was going to be a veterinarian, which would have been a great different path, but I took a class in animal behavior and just found all of the questions fascinating. And so at some level, I think the question I always think about is I'm just really curious about why individuals do what they do. And so fishes are a great system for asking those questions, but it's a much more general question. The other thing I'm really interested in is behavioral interactions or social interactions. So how they respond to one another and how they interact with one another. And also how those have evolved over the history of time.
Yeah, and that seems mind-blowing to me, because when I think about fish in the ocean, they are just swimming around, maybe trying to find food, maybe trying to avoid predators. But the fact that they're interacting with one another, that seems really interesting to me. So can you, maybe specifically with the wrasse that you have worked on for the last 25 years, can you explain a little bit more about the social interaction and explain a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, and it's a really common question I get. I'm sitting on an airplane or something. People will say, "You study fish behavior? They have behavior?" I mean, a lot of people haven't been exposed to it. But the reality is they have really complex behaviors. So in the ocellated wrasse, the main interactions we study are during reproduction, and so they have aggressive interactions. They compete with one another. They also, the males court females, so they try to attract females. They also have dominance hierarchies. So they have social interactions where one might be sort of being more dominant to the other, and the other is being sort of appeasing them or being submissive. And they also just, they interact in a lot of ways that communicate things about one another.
Yeah, and that seems so cool that you're able to describe these behaviors. And like, how do you do that? Like, how do you collect this data? Are you out there in the field looking at these fish, making detailed observations, or are you in the lab or in a controlled setting? Like, how are you able to understand behavior like this?
Yeah, great question. Well, people can do all of those things, but the main thing we do is that we go underwater on scuba and we observe the fish directly. And so we also use cameras and videos, and we take underwater paper and pencils, like normal pencils that we all use, and take notes about the behaviors that we observe underwater. So maybe I'll shift my background image here for a second. Let's see if it'll work. And what you can see there is, here's a picture of me scuba diving underwater, and what's hanging off of me is actually a slate which has papers attached to it and a notebook attached to it that I take data on. So like, this is what it's like to be in the office with me when I'm in the field. And here's just an image of what it looks like in the field when we're above water. So we work in the Mediterranean and Corsica, and we sleep in a lighthouse when we're there. That's where our accommodations are. And then we gear up in scuba gear and jump underwater with our cameras and our pencils and our paper and just observe what the fish do and what's going on underwater.
Oh, that's so cool. I have never met anyone that has lodged in a lighthouse before. So that's amazing. It sounds
Yeah.
like science can take you anywhere around the world. So, in the Mediterranean, is it a warmer climate? Like, what's it like being underwater? Like, and how long are you down there for? Are you getting cold? Are your fingers going numb observing these fish? What's kind of like the surrounding environment like?
Yeah, so it's a Mediterranean climate, meaning that they, like here we have here in Santa Cruz, they have a winter and they have a summer. It's a little more, their temperatures change a little bit more over the year than ours do. And the water is cold-ish when we get there. So we're usually there in May and June, but it warms up more than our California waters do, at least in this area, in the Santa Cruz area. So we do get cold, but mainly that's because we're staying very still and we try to stay underwater for a long period of time. We're in relatively shallow water, so about 30 feet or 10 meters or above. But because we're watching behavior, we need to spend a lot of time being very still, watching what's going on, and stay down as long as we possibly can. So we're often diving for sometimes 2.5 hours at a stretch, and multiple times a day.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that sounds like a lot of work, but it also sounds really rewarding once you're able to uncover some of this behavior that you see. And we got a question about animal behavior and focusing on, the sexual behavior that these fish kind of exhibit. And so you said that they are defending and aggressive, which sounds really interesting to me, and just that fish are being aggressive with one another. But are they making noise when they do this? Are they flashing certain parts of their body when they're being aggressive? Are they tail flicking? Like what exactly is going on? Because this is so fascinating.
Yeah. So there are definitely fish that people have studied that make noise and like, they make noise to communicate with one another, like many animals do. In the species that I study, we haven't ever found any direct evidence of them using like a vocal sound or some kind of sound to communicate with one another. So they're mainly communicating by their behavior and their body postures. So for example, a really common aggressive behavior that fishes exhibit is that they flare all of their fins out. So they sort of, like a cat who kind of puffs themselves up, they make themselves look big and they flare their fins up. And they do that at one another as sort of a display that says, hey, don't mess with me, basically. And then in response to that, if it was a subordinate individual, an individual that wanted to say, hey, I don't want to fight with you, they actually do a classic bending behavior. So if you've ever seen a dog who rolls on its back and puts its belly up, it's the fish equivalent of that. And so they actually kind of bend their body either in an S shape or just in a C curve, and they kind of roll their body so that they're actually showing their belly a little bit as well. Sort of a vulnerable posture that says, I'm no threat.
Right. And are these mostly males doing this or females? Or could you even tell the sex of the fish when you're down there taking field observations? Yeah.
Great question. So in the species we study, you can tell the males and females apart, and they can tell one another apart. You can tell that as well because they respond differently to each other. Let's see. So it's mainly the males in the species we study. It's mainly the males that are doing these sort of really obvious, aggressive and submissive displays, but females have all kinds of complex behaviors as well. The females are choosing among nests. So the nesting males build nests out of algae, and the females are choosing among those nests where they're going to lay their eggs. And they also interact with one another a lot. And so there's female-female interactions that go on as well.
Ooh, interesting. And we got a question about how understanding this animal behavior, and I think you mentioned this earlier in our conversation too, how it has evolved over time. And so I'm hoping that you can explain a little bit more about the evolution of this behavior and what we know about it.
So the evolutionary history of which behaviors?
Of just, let's say of sexual selection in these animals.
Yeah. So in there's so much variation. So I'll just focus on the group of fishes that we've studied. So there's actually 10 species of these wrasses that are closely related to the ones I study. And they had a common ancestor that came into the Mediterranean. So that's what we know from studying them from a genetic and evolutionary perspective. And then they radiated out rapidly into 10 different species. And what's fascinating is although they had this common ancestor, they all have really different social and mating systems. So For some of them, they don't have any kind of parental care. They just lay the eggs on algae and swim away. In another one, they build a nest together. A male and a female build a nest together and take care of the eggs and have really complex parental care. In other ones, only the males provide care. So in the species I study and a bunch of other species, it's actually the, the males who do all of the work in that sense. They build a nest and take care of the offspring. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of variety. Another thing that's different among those species, probably due to sexual selection, which is variation in mating and reproductive success, that's how we define sexual selection, is that in some species, the males and females are really different. So you were asking whether or not you could tell males and females apart. In some, the males and females look very, very similar. They're not very different. So more like humans, very similar. And in some, the males can be, you know, almost 10 times as large as the females and way more colorful. And so there can be really striking differences between males and females in some of the species. Yeah. And it can evolve really rapidly, relatively speaking, not over our lifetime necessarily, but over millions of years for sure.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. And so I am curious a little bit how understanding this fish behavior, reproductive traits, sexual selection can all relate to conservation and management.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so at a fundamental level, when we're worried about conserving a species, or if we're thinking about how best to manage a species, the most important things are survival and reproduction. And so, of course, there are external forces like the environment and predators and diseases that affect survival and reproduction. But outside that, one of the most fundamental things influencing animal survival and reproduction is behavior. And so our understanding of behavior can really inform how an organism is going to respond as we change conditions. So an example that I really like, I worked for a while in California sheephead, which is a species that we see off the coast of California here. And they actually change from being female when they're young to becoming male when they're older. And one of the things we were able to show is that if you want to manage this fisheries, you have to take that into account. That's an aspect of their reproduction. And also in that species, although it's the females that lay the eggs, the males defend territories. So if you take away all those large males from the fishery focuses on the larger individuals. Actually, you could all of a sudden have a problem where reproduction breaks down. And so although it may seem like this kind of esoteric thing, this weird thing that fish do, they change sex and they defend territories and all this stuff, if we didn't know that, we wouldn't actually be able to manage the fisheries nearly as well. And the same is true for conservation. If we don't know how and why they reproduce the way they do, we won't actually be able to know what kind of habitat they need in order to persist and survive.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I love the example that you used with the California sheephead. So can I ask, how many different species of fish have you worked on throughout your career? I mean, it sounds like I'm going to assume quite a bit.
Well, it's funny. That's a hard one to answer. I'm not sure I could do a tally because on one hand, if I think about the number of fish that I've studied directly, like I've taken the actual data on them, it's somewhere between 10 and 20 probably. But we do what are called comparative studies, which is we actually look at the evolutionary history of a whole group. And then we think about, well, what are the sort of particular traits that have evolved in each of those species? And what does that tell us about like the big picture of evolution and diversity of life on Earth? And so then if I include those, it's thousands. And in fact, fishes are the most diverse vertebrate group. So there's probably about 12 to 15,000 fishes, depending on who you listen to and how you count them. And so, yeah, some of our studies have looked at thousands and thousands of fish.
Yeah. Awesome. That sounds like, oh man, I can't even imagine. It just sounds like you are this incredible marine scientist. And I know I'm just throwing praises at you, and but it's really, really inspiring. And so what was it like becoming a marine scientist and working in this field? Like, did you know that you always wanted to go down this path?
No, I didn't. In fact, I joke sometimes because when I was a kid, I went through a phase where I wanted to be a florist, which I find kind of baffling now. But just for everyone who's listening who thinks, what do I want to do with my life? You never know. So when I was in college, I knew that I liked biology. So I started taking biology classes. And at first, I wasn't thinking of it as a major, but I took a class that I just loved. And I thought, okay, I'll be a biology student. But I thought, as I said before, I thought I would become a veterinarian. And so I saw this class on animal behavior and I thought, that sounds interesting and it would probably be useful as a vet, if I was advising people on their animals. And I took that course and I just absolutely loved the topic and the questions. And the same professors told us about a field course and we traveled to French Polynesia to Moorea. And that was my first real marine exposure. And so we were snorkeling and we were watching fish and we're collecting data and doing science for the first time. And I just thought this is the most amazing thing. I want to do this for the rest of my life. And so then I went to graduate school and I've been lucky enough to continue doing it ever since. Yeah.
That's really cool. And I'm really glad that you shared that you took a field course because it just shows that field courses can be so pivotal in, an early career. So that's really, really great to hear. So it sounds like you've had an awesome career. You are discovering new things all the time. But I have to ask, what is the absolute best part of your job? If you could, narrow it down to one or two things.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to narrow it down to two things. What I always say is I love science and I love the people who do science. And so the first thing I love is just being able to be out in the natural world and be curious and ask questions about the animals. So that's my first thing. And my second thing is that I just love working with my students and collaborators and colleagues as part of that process. So I love the natural world and being curious about it and love sharing that with other people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Like I said earlier, it's always such a pleasure to learn more about you and your work and your career and what you do. So unfortunately, that is actually all the time that we have today. And I can't believe it. It flew by. So I know that I have a million more questions for you, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So do you have a website or social media or a place where folks can go online to learn more about you and the research that you do?
Yeah, so the main thing we have is we have a website, which I think you have the link to, so you can share it, which is our UCSC site, and it talks about our research. It's aimed at, other academics at a certain level, but it certainly has some basic information as well. And if you're curious about the ocellated wrasse, you can watch, there's a PBS Nature special, which is available in a variety of formats, including Netflix and PBS, called Animal Homes. And if you watch the third one, about halfway through, there's a 15-minute segment on us, where we work, and the ocellated wrasse. So if you haven't gotten enough today, that would be one place you could go for more information as well.
Yeah. Well, I know I'm going to be watching it after this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing those resources. I just dropped the link to your website in the YouTube live chat so folks can go and explore that as well. I can also say your website has some really awesome pictures on it too. So, and then that link to your website will also be included in the video description below after we wrap up today's conversation. But Suzanne, just thank you again so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's my pleasure too. And thank you for everyone who tuned in.
Yeah, exactly. So I also want to send my sincere gratitude to everyone that tuned in today. It's really supporters like you that make these online programs possible and free and available to the public. So if you liked today's Labside Chat, and if you're in the position, I ask that you please either make a donation or become a member with the Seymour Center so we can keep this program going. More information can be found on our website, seymourcenter.ucsc.edu, or go ahead and click on the links below in the video description. So thank you again, everyone. We'll see you soon. Bye.